The crowd on LaSalle Street didn't notice the moment it almost happened. The second a legend stopped walking because of a broken guitar. People would later swear they were there, that they heard it, that they felt something in the air, but at 4:12 p.m. on a freezing November afternoon in 1988, nobody paid attention to the skinny homeless teenager sitting on the cold concrete steps outside the train station, playing 5 mismatched strings on a guitar held together by electrical tape. His name was Evan Hale, though the city didn't care about names, and the commuters moving past him in gray coats and hurried footsteps certainly didn't. To them, he was part of the scenery, like the newspaper boxes or the steam rising from the street grates, a background detail in a city designed to move forward without looking down. The guitar case in front of him was open, and inside lay 87 cents, a bent subway token, and a folded receipt he used as a pick when his fingers hurt too much to keep playing. 3 hours of sitting there had earned him less than a cup of coffee. A businessman stepped directly over the case without breaking stride. A woman pulling a child along the sidewalk turned the boy's head away as they passed. A group of teenagers laughed at something else entirely and never saw him. Evan didn't stop playing. He couldn't. The melody he kept repeating was only about 20 seconds long, the same progression over and over, slightly uneven because the neck of the guitar bowed inward, forcing his fingers to press harder than they should have. He didn't know the whole song. He didn't even know the words. All he knew was that his older sister Lily had played that melody in their bedroom at night before everything fell apart, before the accident, before the sirens, and the hospital, and the silence that followed. After she died, the apartment felt wrong, the walls too empty, the rooms too loud with absence, and eventually the foster system felt even worse, so he left with the only thing he still had that connected him to her, the guitar. He slept in stations, bus terminals, and occasionally church basements when it was too cold to risk the night air, but every afternoon he came to those steps because the echo of the station entrance carried sound farther, and for a few minutes each day, it almost sounded like the melody filled a room again. What he didn't know was that 50 feet away, a man in a long brown coat had just stepped out of a taxi after a flight delay and was walking toward a waiting car to take him across town. Bob Dylan had not planned to walk this street, had not planned to be in Chicago for more than a few hours, and certainly had not planned to hear his own music played on a guitar that sounded like it had survived a small war. He was irritated, tired, and thinking about recording schedules when the melody reached him, faint at first under the traffic and the rumble of buses, familiar enough to make him slow his pace, but strange enough to make him turn his head. It took a moment for recognition to settle in. The odd dissonance of hearing something he had written transformed into something fragile, like a memory instead of a performance. Dylan stopped walking. People behind him adjusted course, stepping around him with mild annoyance, never realizing why he'd paused. He listened. The boy wasn't playing for attention. He wasn't even looking up between repetitions, his eyes fixed on his fingers, as if the world might disappear if he lost the pattern. The tempo drifted, and one note buzzed because of the warped fretboard. Yet there was an honesty in it Dylan recognized immediately, the sound of someone holding on to a feeling rather than trying to entertain strangers. He remembered arriving in New York decades earlier with almost nothing, remembered cheap rooms and borrowed couches and a guitar that barely stayed in tune, remembered how music had been less about audiences and more about survival. The memory rooted him in place. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Commuters continued around him like water around a stone. A police officer glanced briefly but saw nothing worth investigating. The boy kept playing, unaware that the man who had written the melody now stood only yards away, hands in his coat pockets, listening not as a celebrity, but as someone recognizing a piece of himself. The cold wind lifted a loose page of newspaper across the sidewalk, brushing the boy's show. He didn't notice. He reached the final note again, paused, and immediately began the progression from the beginning, careful, almost protective of it, as if each repetition kept someone alive a little longer. Dylan felt the decision forming before he consciously made it. He was supposed to keep moving, get into the waiting car, continue the day as planned. Instead, he stepped off the curb toward the station steps. In a city where thousands pass that spot every hour, no one understood that something important had just shifted, that a man known around the world had heard a truth carry through 5 worn strings and had chosen, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, to stop walking. For several seconds, Evan just stared at the paper in his hand. The crowd that had gathered slowly dissolved back into the rhythm of the city, as if the moment had been swallowed by traffic and footsteps. But the folded note remained real in his palm. He read the address again and again, afraid the letters might rearrange themselves into nothing. A music school. Noon. Asked for Mr. Keller. That was all. No explanation, no promise, just direction. That night he barely slept on the station bench, clutching the paper inside his jacket so tightly he woke every hour to make sure it hadn't slipped away. The next morning he almost didn't go. Places with clean windows and polished doors were not built for kids who carried everything they owned in a torn backpack. But just before noon, he found himself standing outside the brick building, watching children walk and carrying violins and clarinets. He hesitated, then pushed the door open. A receptionist looked up, surprised but gentle. Evan handed her the note without speaking. She read it, picked up a phone, and a moment later a gray-haired man hurried down the hallway. "You must be Evan," he said softly. Evan nodded. "We've been waiting for you." The words didn't make sense. "Why?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Because someone called last night and said a boy with a broken guitar would come, and that he deserved a place to play indoors." He led Evan into a small practice room. In the corner stood a simple acoustic guitar, clean and perfectly strung. Evan stopped at the doorway. "I can't pay," he said quickly. "You don't have to," Mr. Keller replied. "Your lessons, food, and tutoring are already arranged." Evan picked up the guitar carefully and strummed once. The sound rang clear, filling the room in a way he'd never heard before. He played the melody he knew, and this time his fingers didn't fight the strings. When he reached the part he once repeated endlessly, he continued forward, remembering the whispered lyric from the day before. For the first time, he finished the whole song. Months passed. Evan learned chords, songs, and eventually how to sing without fear. He still kept the broken guitar, untouched, leaning in the corner of the room. It reminded him that the music had existed before the help arrived. Years later, he didn't become famous. Instead, he played quietly in hospital wards and shelters, sitting beside people who had nowhere else to put their paying. One afternoon, a nurse asked why he came every week without fail. Evan thought about the freezing station steps and the stranger who had chosen to stop. "Because someone once listened to me," he said. In his office hung the taped-together guitar and a framed square of paper. The ink had faded, but one line was still clear. "You don't owe me a song. You owe someone else the moment." BD. Evan finally understood. The gift hadn't been money or rescue. It had been a chance and a responsibility. And every time he tuned his guitar beside someone who felt invisible, he repeated the same decision that had changed his life. He stopped walking and listened. For a long time, Evan didn't move. The paper felt heavier than it should have, just a small folded square resting in his palm, while the sound of the city slowly returned around him. The crowd lingered a few seconds after the man disappeared into the sidewalk traffic, as if everyone expected him to come back. But Chicago kept moving, and eventually strangers drifted away, conversations resuming, footsteps picking up speed again. Within minutes the moment felt impossible, like something he might have imagined from hunger or cold. Evan looked down at the address again to make sure it was still there. A music school, 2 bus lines away on the north side. No explanation, no instructions. Just an address and a short line written beneath it in careful handwriting. Noon. Asked for Mr. Keller. Evan folded it again and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket beside the guitar pick receipt he carried everywhere. He packed his guitar slowly, hands shaking, then sat another few minutes trying to decide what to do with a chance he didn't understand. Nobody had ever given him a tomorrow before. The street usually meant surviving until night, and hoping the night meant waking up again. That evening he rode the train without a destination, using the last of the subway token he'd saved. He barely slept in the station, afraid the paper would vanish if he closed his eyes. Morning came gray and cold, and by 11:40 he was standing outside a brick building with tall windows and a brass plaque reading Lakeview Community Music Center. Through the glass he could see pianos, chairs, and children carrying instrument cases bigger than they were. He almost turned around. Places like that weren't for kids who slept in bus terminals. But he remembered the harmony beside his voice, steady and certain, and pushed the door open. Inside smelled like wood polish and sheet music. A receptionist looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. Evan pulled out the folded page and held it out like proof he was allowed to exist there. "I was told to ask for Mr. Keller." She read it, her expression changing, then picked up a phone. 30 seconds later, a man in his 50s hurried down the hallway, glasses crooked, eyes already kind. He stopped when he saw the handwriting. "You're Evan?" he asked. Evan nodded slowly. The man crouched slightly, mirroring the way the stranger had the day before. "We've been expecting you." Evan didn't understand. "Why?" Mr. Keller smiled faintly. "Because someone called last night. Said a boy with a broken guitar would come, and that he shouldn't ever have to play on the street again." The words hit him harder than the cold ever had. Mr. Keller led him into a practice room. On a stand in the corner rested a simple acoustic guitar, clean, unscarred, 6 matching strings. Evan stopped in the doorway. "I can't pay," he said immediately. "You don't have to," Keller replied. "Your lessons, your meals here after class, even tutoring, it's handled." Evan's hands trembled. Why would he do that? Keller looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes someone hears something in you before you do." Evan approached the guitar carefully, as if it might disappear. He strummed once. The sound rang clear and full, filling the room in a way his old instrument never could. He almost cried at the difference. "Go ahead," Keller encouraged. Evan played the melody he knew, but now it flowed easier, his fingers not fighting warped frets or mismatched strings. When he reached the part he didn't know months earlier, he hesitated, then remembered the whispered lyric and continued. He finished the entire song for the first time in his life. The last note faded, and he realized he was smiling. Keller nodded. "We'll start with that one," he said. Weeks became months. Evan attended lessons, learned chords, read music slowly, and discovered songs weren't fragile memories, but living things he could carry anywhere. He still kept his broken guitar, though he never played it again. It leaned in the corner of the practice room, a reminder of where the sound began. He gained weight, slept indoors, talked more. The staff never treated him like charity. They treated him like a student. Occasionally he asked if the man would come back. Keller only said, "I think he already did what he came for." Years passed. Evan never became famous. He never recorded albums or stood under stage lights. Instead, he chose something quieter. He began visiting hospitals with a borrowed guitar, playing softly for children who spent more time with machines than with playgrounds. He noticed the same thing he once felt on the station steps. When music filled a room, fear shrank a little. One afternoon, a nurse asked why he did it every week without fail. Evan thought about the cold concrete steps, the near-empty guitar case, and a stranger who stopped walking. "Because someone once listened to me when nobody else did," he answered. On his office wall years later hung 2 things: the broken guitar, still wrapped in tape, and a small framed square of paper, slightly yellowed with time. The address had faded, but the final line remained clear. "You don't owe me a song. You owe someone else the moment. B.D." Evan understood now. The move wasn't money. It wasn't rescue. It was responsibility. And every time he sat beside a hospital bed, tuning his strings before playing, he repeated the same quiet decision that had changed his life: to stop walking when he heard someone who needed to be heard.